Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. With me today is Bennett's Phylactery. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Good to be here.
Good to have you on. So you are the now well-known organizer of the Natal Conference, which happened to have happen last year here in Austin at the very end of 2023. And natalism and concerns over population decline have been getting increased attention a lot lately. Elon Musk, in particular, is probably the most well-known person who's been very outspoken about the need for people to have more babies and for us to figure out what we're going to do to combat decreasing birth rates. And so as someone who's taken the initiative and sort of begun organizing at least large scale events around this, I wanted to have you on to discuss the problem of population collapse, the natalism movement at large, and also get your take on how the conference went in 2023 and what your expectations are going forward for this year. So to start out, I just wanted to ask you a little bit, like, how did the conference get started in the first place, and when did you sort of realize that it was going to become a reality?
So it was actually a couple of my friends from Exit. We were hanging out in Northern California at one of the guys' places, and we started watching Tucker's End of Men documentary, where he's talking about basically like the biomedical side of it, and declining sperm counts and declining testosterone levels, and just sort of the microplastics and xenoestrogens thing and obesity. And I realized, like, number one, there's like a much bigger conversation to be had around that issue. It was sort of the defining ethos of like what brought us together at Exit was like, how are we going to have kids? How are our kids going to have kids? How do we like create a society that iterates? Because like some of your listeners might be familiar with like Spandrel's concept of like bio-Leninism and the IQ shredder, and the fact that like the most successful, financially successful and maybe educationally successful cohorts of our society are essentially sterile.
Yeah.
And seeing if there's a way to fix that, and seeing if there's a way to encourage specifically those people, but I mean, frankly, everybody to have more kids, both because it's going to create economic and humanitarian catastrophes in the next century, but also just because life is good, human culture is good. The things that I want there to be people who remember the stories that I grew up with, and the songs and the culture and everything, all about human life. Basically, if you care about any of it, then somebody's got to pick up the torch. And so we thought, there's definitely more to be said on the medical side, but also there's like the relationships between men and women that are so fraught and so poisonous right now. And the challenge of raising children in this economic and political environment, and how do you get the machinery that delivers a person from being a child to getting educated, employed, married, and starting a family, and get their family on the same trajectory? How do you make that happen for people? And so we decided the best thing for us to do was to get the smartest people that we could find who cared about this issue in a room together and see what we could come up with. And so we started knocking doors, of our friends and, people who we knew who were like, one of the things that was dramatic about watching Tucker's documentary was how many of those guys we already knew. And we're like, oh, well, we'll just bring them together first of all, and then see who else we can find who's interested. And it
Yeah.
turned out to be just an incredible crew, both in terms of like the people who presented, but also just the people who came to watch and participate. It was an incredible group of people.
And so, like, what were some of the key takeaways, from the first conference, getting those people together? I know there were there were the speeches, of course, but then there was also the workshops in between and other events that happened around the conference. Were there any big, do you feel like there was any big progress made in terms of beginning to answer some of these questions around how do we get this culture that is regenerative, really?
Yeah, I think, and my takeaways are going to be different than some other people's takeaways. What I found most interesting about that conference was the extent to which we had a lot of like technologists and a lot of like sort of values oriented people um who were having their first encounter with each other on like this these grounds of like mutual respect and like, yes, mutual respect for each other, but even more than that, mutual respect for the problem. Like,
Hmm.
this is a really, really big problem, and we do not have the answer. And so everybody came with a lot of humility, which I thought was really powerful. And people who I would not have expected to mingle really did. There weren't there were definitely camps represented there, but they weren't like cliqued up and hiding out from each other. They were very much commingling and interacting. And how do you solve the problem? I think basically my conclusion from the conference was that you solve the problem by building a boat. Like, it's not about stopping the rain, it's about building a boat. And so you get the people who care about this and you try to get them as many resources as you possibly can, and you get them as wired up to one another as they possibly can be, and you try to solve the problem on the individual and community level. Like, I don't think that there's going to be some meme that fixes the broader culture that like turns the whole battleship around. I think to a large extent, most of the consequences of demographic collapse are baked in.
Hmm.
And so it's about connecting the people who care about their own uh, families and their own family's future and who care about each other and getting them in a situation where they can socialize and, introduce their families to one another and maybe, find a girl, find a guy and connect on that level. Like, I think it's primarily going to be solved not by changing a lot of minds, but by empowering the people who already care.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think one of the things that's interesting about this problem is how do you avoid like this sort of resignation that you could fall into? Because in a way, like there's going to be people in the future of some kind, probably no matter what. I don't think we're going to extinguish ourselves as a species. But it's sort of tautological in that like the people that will be there will be the people that manage to have kids despite all of this other environmental interference.
Yes.
Um, and so I guess I'm wondering, like, to what extent do you think that like there are people who are maybe, you know, on the edge of being in like the reproducing population, but like need a little bit of push to get there to sort of get over the hump,
Yeah.
versus people where it's sort of there's sort of like no hope for. Um, how do you kind of think about that?
I think that there are very few people, if any, for whom there is individually no hope.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's always, I mean, our whole scene uh, is all about what can you learn from the general and what can you learn from the particular, right? Like, what trends, what statistical properties, what is the aggregate? Like, those are all interesting things to talk about. But I think that people who care deeply about the truth of those statistical realities sometimes have a tendency to act as though those are like individually governing, like those are determinative of like your future,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that I don't agree with. And so there's a lot that you can do as an individual, and there's a lot that you can do for your community. I really don't think about it in terms of like, you know, like who's beyond saving, right? It's more about, there are so many people who already care and who want help and need help,
Hmm.
that I could spend all my time trying to help them and have like no time left over to try to sell somebody who's not sold on this. Does that make sense? Like it's not about being black pilled. It's not about being nihilistic. It's about like the job is plenty big, even if you're only concerned with the people who you don't have to sell on it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's kind of how I feel about it. Uh, I do think that, you know, when you think about like tautologically, like will humanity survive? Like, yeah, probably in some form. And you know, like I was listening to this anti-natalist
Hmm.
who was talking about how she believes in the eradication of like trees and multicellular life on the grounds that on a long enough timeline they will eventually develop consciousness, which means they will become consciously
Right,
beings.
right. Yeah, right, right.
Right. And so like you could almost back into that and be like, well, you know, it doesn't matter if humanity goes extinct, because someday there'll be like a tree or an amoeba civilization, and that will be conscious, and then we'll have consciousness, and that's really all that matters. And that's obviously not my perspective, but like the way and the extent to which you care about this issue depends to some extent on how you define your terms. And like a lot of the AI people have a really interesting perspective, because they're like, oh yeah, it'll just be silicon intelligence, and that, you know, intelligence is the point,
Yeah,
and
right.
so it'll be
The whole
fine. Like, who
purpose of life
cares?
is intelligence, of course.
Right. Which and like I actually would agree with that statement. I just don't agree that intelligence and like computation are synonymous. And so like that's their perspective, which is, you
Hmm.
know, it's that your brain is just a really impressive meat computer.
Yeah.
And we're on the verge of creating an even more impressive silicon computer. And therefore your meat computer is like not morally relevant, really. Um, and I mean, that's just fundamentally at odds with where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
I want babies and human beings.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting. I've heard this like utilitarian take. I associate it with effective altruism more than anything else, but I'm not sure if I'm uh, impugning everyone in that movement by doing so. But what I will say is, when they talk about, I have heard this ridiculous argument about, well, even the trees will eventually become sentient and, therefore experience suffering and therefore shouldn't exist. And it reminds me of Jordan Peterson's recounting of Dostoevsky's Underground Man and Notes from Underground, where it's like life is so wretched and horrible that it would be better if there was nothing at all. And that's sort of the position. And I guess if that's someone's position, then I'm sorry that they feel that way, but I don't think it's at all a defensible position. And it's so absurd to me that anybody that takes this view has any cachet with it in our culture, or is allocated resources to support it, because if that's truly your view and that's an honest position that you're coming from, you're not a dishonest actor, then why are you even talking in the first place? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's there's not really, we're so accustomed to this materialistic rationalist frame of argument.
Mhm.
And when you start we start saying things like that, you are approaching terminal statements of value that have no, they're just not tractable to like rational analysis. You can't like you there's nothing to say to a person like that. Like if you think that life in the balance is not worth living, um I, like there's not like a set of facts, like a case that I can propound to you uh, that's gonna change your mind, or certainly that's like uh falsifiable. Like we could like swirl around some liquid in our Erlenmeyer flask and be like, we've proved that life's
Yeah.
actually worth living, or
Stick
life's not
around,
worth
buddy.
living.
It's gonna get better. Like,
Yeah, right. That's a ludicrous the whole frame of that argument is ludicrous. And
hmm.
so yeah, you're coming up to the bedrock of, people get allergic when I say religious questions, but metaphysical questions, certainly.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, like for me, I don't have to persuade you of my entire like religious framework and like what I believe about the meaning of life and everything. Uh, but if we can basically agree that like life is like existence is better than non-existence,
Hmm.
then there's like a lot we can say from that point. And there's
Yeah.
not a lot we can say if we don't have that agreement.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about like what I kind of see as the broad camps in the natalism uh, movement. You know, you talked about getting the smartest people that you can together. We sort of all agree on this fundamental premise that more humans would be better. Um, and I was thinking about this the other night, and I split it up into in my a 2 by 2 matrix. So the way that I perceive it is that there are basically 4 camps. There is the religious, uh, like more like there's the religious, more procreation is better um, people. There's the religious, more procreation of the right kind is better people. There are the techno-optimist, more procreation is better people. And there are the techno-optimist, more procreation of the right kind is better. Um, and so there's sort of these two bases for like the value systems, which is either technologically oriented or religiously concerned. And then there's sort of this basis of like more humans in the absolute sense is better, or more humans in a conditional sense is better. And that's sort of how I see the whole movement split up. What do you think about that assessment of the camps?
I think that's probably close to right. I would actually, I mean, so the agreement that I see between the various like is it just people in general, or is it what kind of people? The the reason I think that there's a big tent possible on that question
Hmm.
is that I would say like at minimum, uh, we need to propagate what we have. Like your line and what you have, like your culture, things that your society has produced, sort of human civilization is worth keeping going, and we should keep it going. Now, does that mean more people? Does that mean more of a certain kind of person? Like that's when you sort of have uh the debate. But like I personally, like, I'm a little bit agnostic on that question. Maybe I'm not like the totally agnostic, but I'm less interested. Like those are not the fighting lines for me,
Hmm.
right? If somebody says no, it's a particular kind of person, I'm not offended. And if another person says like no, it's just more people, that doesn't bother me either. So I'm just sort of like, this thing that we're doing should keep going, and that clearly means we should be having more kids than we currently are,
Right.
even if it doesn't mean we're all having like 9, right? Um, so that's the directional uh, agreement that I think we all pretty much share. But yeah, I think that's one of the tension points is like, and to be honest with you, I see it as the selection pressure against fertility is so strong now, and it's so cheap to like avoid fertility now,
Hmm.
that I actually think sort of regardless of what you want to happen, just the effort of like, if I blast it out there, everyone should have kids.
Mhm.
Um, who is actually going to have kids on the basis of that messaging is the kind of people that I would prefer to have kids anyway.
Right.
Because if you like don't have your act together and you're like not values aligned and you're like not like if you're sort of bought into the things that I think are like poisonous and like bad, uh my megaphone is that's not going to be enough to get you to have kids anyway. So like when people talk about like, oh no, we have to counter signal this natalism rhetoric because it'll lead to the wrong people having kids. I'm like, I no, there's like those people are not having kids no matter what I say.
Right.
Like it's yeah. So anyway, like I think that is a good axis. And then the technologist versus sort of religious axis is a really interesting one, and that's where I think there's the most opportunity for synthesis. Because I think both parties to some extent recognize that their answers are not totally sufficient. You know, religious people can be like, yes, it is. You know, in my case, like, yes, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that's the answer, that's the right thing. But observationally, on the ground, the fertility rates are declining. There is a problem, and it's not being solved by whatever the answer currently is. So we got to think about this at minimum.
Hmm.
And maybe that's, you know, maybe we need to. Does that mean like we have to return to our old time values? Does that mean we have to come up with, you know, a new understanding of what our values are? Does it mean that there's like some technological tools that might have some bearing on this problem? You know, I have opinions about which of those three it is, but like you can see how people are sort of opening up to like some different possibilities. And then on the technologist side, I can't tell you how many of these guys I meet who are like, all right, tell me the Mormon secrets to family formation and fertility. Like, what are you guys hearing at your secret Mormon meetings that are persuading you to have babies? And I think that what I tell those guys is like, yeah, you can't really instrumentalize this. You can't really like, it's not a social tech that you can just sort of adopt and deploy. There's a package that everything there's a coherent whole.
Hmm.
Um, but I like where their head's at. I like that they're sort of being like, okay, there's maybe some values component to this that I need to understand better and I need to ask some questions about. And so those are like the two groups of people like reaching out for the synthesis.
Yeah.
And I think as we have these conversations going forward, we're going to start to get to some better answers.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the selection pressure against fertility, which is sort of if you think about it, is paradoxical. But that's what seems to be happening. There's some kind of societal, economic, whatever you want to call it, filter going on. And I don't think it's probably too over determined to point at like one thing, although people
Yeah.
do look for silver bullet answers. Um, but there's a lot of different things that are speculated as being the cause. You know, you of course have the pill, you have women entering into the workforce, women's education, you have, you know, the proliferation of pornography and other things that distract mostly men. Um, how do you think about reducing the selection pressure, you know, beyond just propagandizing the message of like, we should have kids, more kids are better. If you are someone who wants to have kids, we're going to try to figure out how we can facilitate that happening. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think about sort of this whole host of pressures to not have kids, also later fertility, um, that, uh, you know, like, do some of those things are some of those things like clear culprits in your mind? Do some of those things need to be uh, thrown away or sacrificed? completely? Is there some sort of hybrid approach where we get to keep a lot of those things and then still find a way to have kids? I think a lot of the techno-optimists in particular want to believe that nothing about our society really needs to fundamentally change if we just keep like getting better at like allowing people to, have 3 kids starting at 38 or something.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that'll be enough, but clearly that's not historically precedented. It's still very difficult and expensive. Um, and so I'm just wondering how do you think about this whole weird complex of pressures, and which ones do you think are more are easier to sort of get a grasp on than others? There are some that
Yeah.
are kind of going to be unchanging outside of like very particular subcultures.
Yeah. So I would lay it at two big ones, two big causes. And to be clear up front, uh, these are not, these are certainly not any particular person's fault. They're not men's fault. They're not women's fault. This is we are all in the soup together on this.
Hmm.
Um, but the average household income in America is like 60 grand. And a lot of people with money do not think about what that means. They really can't grok what it's like to live on 60K. And half of America is living on less than that. And when you consider the cost of childcare for a dual income household that's pulling in 60K, uh, you can maybe make 2 kids pencil. You cannot make 3 kids pencil. It doesn't work. And at least some families need to be having 3 kids to be at replacement fertility, right?
Hmm.
And so it's like there's just this very basic math problem that and you know the sort of mainstream Democrat or like Democrat adjacent solution is socialized childcare. But when you think about uh, the quality of that environment, like how expensive it would be to essentially like we're basically radically undervaluing the role of mothering uh and radically underpricing it. And so when we try to do the math on like how are we going to provide like mothering as a service at scale, we're finding that it's just too expensive. um it's just too expensive to have women earning for the purpose of paying for childcare. I mean, you're essentially asking, and you know that's to say nothing of how much is already sort of shoveled into the public school system. Which then it's like you're sort of kicking the can down the road one generation because a child raised in that framework, the sort of antenatal memes are so strong from like end to end in that system. You don't want your kids, especially your girls, in that system.
Hmm.
Um, but even just from a bare like arithmetic sense, it doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And so, and you know that absolutely ramifies to income inequality and all kinds of other. I mean, I mean, Elizabeth Warren, you know, back when she was, you know, when kind of libs were allowed to notice some things, she wrote the Two Income Trap,
Yeah.
which is about how we have built a society in which people are so dependent on outsourcing and externalizing so much of what used to be done inside the family. And by the nature of like the way that housing is distributed in this country, you need to make a lot of money for your kids to go to a decent public school, for them to live in a decent neighborhood where they're safe, and uh, and then for you to be able to outsource their supervision for 10 hours a day at least, um, for the first, you know, at least 5 years of their life, and then you send them to public school and it's another, 12. All of which somebody is paying for, right? So, okay, so that's one factor is household incomes and dual income families and 3+ kids. You can't make that work arithmetically, not without massive redistribution.
Hmm.
And even then, it's not clear that it works. So that's one. The other side of this is search costs. We have made raising a family, starting a family and raising a family so massively risky to both men and women
Mhm.
that people are terrified. They're terrified of getting married. And they feel, not without reason, that they need to do this like intensive search process with absolutely everybody that they're considering, not least because maybe 100 years ago, you could sort of date around and be like, I'm Presbyterian, you're Presbyterian. That means there's a lot of big questions that we have the same answers to. And it's going to be little things like, I'm not crazy about Mexican food or like whatever. Like we're going to have to deal with a smaller set of problems. But now it's like everybody is expected to like synthesize their own, custom value set, like out of stellar hydrogen. And then you got to go look for somebody who just happens to like already belong to this religion that you made up for yourself.
Yeah.
And it's, how the hell are you supposed to find somebody with that kind of alignment? And then, once you found that person, you've got to like vet them personally to make sure they're not like just like bullshitting to get into your pants.
Yeah.
And like you ask people, like, how long do they need to assess a potential marriage partner to have kids? And they'll be like 2 years. And, you'll look at the sort of fertility window. Like, when are you going to start looking? Oh, about age, 25. Okay. So you're not even ready
Yeah.
to start looking
How
until
many
age 25.
candidates are you going to fit in there?
Yeah, that's 5 candidates, right? Until your fertility window starts to dramatically close for the ladies. And so like, and you tell a woman in her early 20s, like, you get to seriously assess 5 men in your entire life at maximum. And like that's like, I think women who hear that are often so profoundly demoralized by it that they just reject it. That like their brain cannot
Yeah.
accept that, because it's like a really scary, like sad thing. And so a lot of women are like, well, and besides which, with marriage law, and this is, both on the men's side and the women's side,
Mhm.
and we talked about this at the conference, because we've rendered marriage a completely unenforceable contract. Like, it's totally subjective. It's totally up to like your lawyers and the judge as far as like how you cut the pie. Like, nothing is really stipulated in advance unless you like go in for a prenup ahead of time, which is this very unromantic and kind of gross thing that most people don't feel like doing. In the absence of that, it's like you're just sort of handing your balls over to this person, or whatever the feminine equivalent is, and like
Your ovaries.
just asking them to trust you, or asking them to not betray you, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, understandably, particularly because men and women's stock goes up and down at different rates over the course of their life, right? If you are a young man marrying a young woman in your early 20s, you're like asking her to give up the time in which she is maximally attractive, like her career is, she has the most career sort of building potential right at that time.
Yeah.
She's got to get all the education, the credentials. She's got to get on the train at that moment. And you're saying, nope, give that up. Come have babies with me. And then as I get wealthier and older and potentially more attractive to potential mates, I promise to stick with you as, you know, the consequences of us having a baby for you career-wise, body-wise, all of that stuff. You take all that on, and I'm going to stick by you, and we're going to stay together. And a lot of women, like the vast majority of women, actually want kids. Like it's not it's actually not controversial, even among like young women. Like, do you want kids? Almost everybody wants kids. But what they are doing is they are making this rational calculation of like, I can either take this colossal bet on somebody who, you know, how could I possibly know them well enough to put my entire life in their hands? And like, you know, you could talk about how these corporate jobs are shitty and boring and unfulfilling, and like the lifestyle is, you know, it's kind of empty and vapid, but the check clears. And there's very clear expectations. There's a clear path. You've got a lot of legal protections. Um, and so it's like, yeah, maybe in the long term, if I find the right man,
Yeah.
but in the meantime, this is working. And so I
Yeah.
think those two things are the big drivers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, uh, I see it right now. I won't get into too many of my own personal details, but, you know, um, in most of the kind of women that I'm interacting with, that I meet, uh, that I'm dating right now, it's like, you know, she's got a job, she makes good money. I've got a job, I make decent money. Even if we've decided ahead of time, like we're aiming to move this whole ship in a direction towards having children. Just the consideration of the sheer cost of living and the amount of money that needs to be coming into the household for her to give up all of that, uh, is tremendous, you know, and it puts an immense pressure on the men who are also out there not only competing with the other men, they're also competing with these other women who are still in the workforce and still want these high
Yeah.
paying jobs and high paying careers.
Yeah.
Um, you got to
And all the
basically,
neighborhoods are priced for two incomes.
right, and you got to basically be able to say, look, baby, I would like to have kids with you. Uh, I want you to make a bet that I can like basically double my income currently and get us to where we need to be so that you don't have to work.
Yeah.
Um, that's
Yeah.
essentially the deal that you're asking these young women
Mhm.
to make, and it's a lot, you know. And then um, they have to have confidence that you're the right guy, that you could actually pull that off, you know.
Yeah.
That like you said before, that you know you would stick with them through all of that. You're also betting on your end, if your plan is to tremendously increase your wealth and status, that they're not going to just decide to leave you and take half of it away and go do something else, like break up
Yeah.
the family, put the kids through all of that. I mean, all of that is extremely detrimental and fracturing to the continuity of your life.
And both
And
men and women see their friends and acquaintances get just savagely betrayed all of the time.
yeah,
And so it's like, yeah, I mean, not to, I don't want to catastrophize too much, but like the trust situation between men and women is a catastrophe. It's a terrible situation.
yeah, yeah. And you know, I was talking about this with a friend the other day. That the thing about marriage is, at least you knew in previous ages that there was a shared cultural understanding of this as like a sacred institution. You know,
Mhm.
but in my case, and in the case of most of the people that I know, there's nothing like that at all. There's
No.
no real conception of it as a sacred union between two people. It's basically an economic arrangement, a transaction of sorts.
A party.
The big sale for the men is that like you kind of need it in order to get kids most of the time if you're not like a degenerate. Um, and And you kind of do it for the kids because it would be better for them. It would be the best thing for them to grow up in a stable household with two married parents.
Mhm.
Um, but there's not a lot besides your, besides you trusting that other person and their capacity to stick by their word on a
Yeah.
social level that's actually keeping you together. And in fact, there's a lot of factors in society that would like to see that break up,
Yes.
um, the amount of like internet memes and stuff and books written on like why you should break up with your partner, why you should get that divorce, why you should leave him, why you should leave her.
Yeah.
If you're a man, you're going to get more valuable as you age, you should be dating younger women, or like all kinds of stuff that's
Right.
out there. And then on top of that, with the connectivity of the internet, both parties are constantly getting new, or what they perceive to be new, opportunities thrown in front of them all the time. You're on,
Right.
if either or both of you are online at all,
Yeah.
and you're an attractive prospect, you're getting hit up constantly by people all the time on social
Right.
media, on the internet, wherever you are. If you have an online presence whatsoever, um, new people are going to make themselves available to you, or at least try to get your attention. And a lot of the discipline and also the conviction that's like part of that dedication to one another is deciding that you're not going to get like tempted by any of that stuff. And that's also
Yeah.
a big trust game. Like it's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's why for me, I'm skeptical of the technologists' arguments.
Hmm.
I'm skeptical that you can resolve that without a sincere belief in some kind of supernal uh, meaning to love, meaning to uh, your relationship and the, the family that you're building. Um, Frankly, as a Latter-day Saint, I think most religions don't have enough of a belief in a supernal relationship between the members of a family. Like I think that part of the reason they're coming unglued is precisely because their theological framework doesn't regard the marriage as with sufficient sanctity.
Hmm.
And so yeah, it's there are metaphysical questions that kind of have to be answered unless like the only sense in which the technologist arguments make sense is if you were sort of arguing that we sort of become cybernetic reptiles where we like lay eggs and then the like these wombs sort of gestate the babies and then they're sort of socialized by machine or so. Like you have to get into real like wild sci-fi land before their uh model of how this is going to work makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And they do have the advantage right now of being able to say like, well, the AI cyber god is going to teach us how to do all this in about 6 weeks. So like, don't worry about it. Like we're we're gonna become weird, cybernetic creatures that exist in this in vats of like jelly or something. But like that's they're sort of waiting on Jesus to come back. And like
Yeah.
it's the kind of thinking that like we are used to getting made fun of about. And now we see these like secular types doing it, and we're like, come on now. I don't know if I don't know if AI Jesus is coming back in 6 weeks. You
Yeah.
like
Let's not wait for the eschaton.
let's not wait. You should have to figure it out.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of like thought termination. Like I don't have to think about that.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I hear from some of the techno people is these more reptilian like solutions. Uh, you know, Setting aside, well, this eventually leads to something like artificial wombs, which some people are already talking about as if they're real, as if they're going to be available to you soon. Like,
As if they're close to real, as if
yeah,
as
right.
if anybody's even really trying. Yeah.
And but another sort of solution that has become more prevalent and more acceptable and I'm just wondering what your take is on it, uh, is like surrogacy. So these surrogacy feels like a sacred violation. That's my gut feeling, and I'm not even a religious person. What is your take on that? Because that's been there are people that I know that are very pro-natalist that have said things like, "Oh, we're going to find a good surrogate if we can find one that we can afford, and that'll be our solution. And it doesn't matter that my wife is, approaching the age where it's harder and harder for her to have children."
Yeah, I'm reminded of sort of the narrative in like the 70s, 80s that was like, we've looked at the nutrient content of breast milk, and this formula, which is like, enriched with iron, and it's mostly like corn syrup solids and like vegetable oil. This is actually nutritionally better for you than breast milk. And it's because they weren't even close to having captured all the variables. They weren't even close. And they were essentially feeding children like poison at the most, and they still are, at the most like sensitive point of their development outside the womb. And it's like the idea that you even think you have that figured out is like asinine to me. And that's just the gestational piece, right? There's also the sense in which and it depends on if it's pure gestational surrogacy, like it's your wife's egg and your sperm in another woman's body. What does that do developmentally? But like even outside the womb, it's like the fact that the woman never went through this transformative 9 months of like the hormonal changes that take place inside a woman's body during pregnancy are radical. It's incredible how much changes. And like in my experience, talking to my wife, it's like there are stages of the pregnancy where I'll just be like, we're going to talk about this later, not because you're like, you're irrational or hysterical or whatever, but just because you're going to be different. Like your opinion on this is going to be so different in about 6 weeks. So like, let's just table it. We'll talk about it later. And it's very similar also to like the birth control thing, where like all these women are discovering that like
You're a different person on birth control.
right. And in terms of like who you're having sex with and like what that relationship's like, and then you go off it and it's like they smell wrong now. It's like the idea that you can just like skip these fundamental processes. It's like putting like the pandas in the zoo and like painting a scene on the walls and being like, oh, that's just we've replicated their habitat. It's like, no, you fucking haven't. Like there's so much more to this, and you are so arrogant to think that you've captured all the variables. So that's roughly my take on surrogacy. And I think basically it's more of like a Chesterton Spence thing. Like you don't know what you're doing. Like don't like leave that alone. It's obviously more complicated than you think it is.
So with regard to this sort of tech optimist religious split, the other question I wanted to ask you is sort of like, and this is the part that I think the tech people are the most deficient on, and the religious people at least have an informed intuition about, but maybe they don't have themselves a very good solution, because as you said earlier, even the established religions are having a hard time actually getting this stuff to stick. Which is how do you get cultural continuity across generations? Because it's one thing to say, okay, well, here and now, there's a bunch of people that would like to have kids, we can let them know that we're trying to create the cultural, social infrastructure, whatever it may be, to facilitate that happening. They're going to have kids, and then what's going to happen to those kids? It's not a given that those kids are going to be set up again to create families of their own. So how do you think about this intergenerational continuity problem of like, well, how do we not just end up back at square one um, in the next cohort?
Yeah, so when I think about the communities that are succeeding on that front, um, it does seem to have a lot to do with uh, freedom of association. It has a lot to do with being able to raise your kids around like-minded people, help them find like-minded partners, uh, raise them in a culture where your values are celebrated, not just respected, but like where the thing you're trying to get your kids to do is actually a high status thing to do.
Hmm.
Um, that I think matters a great deal, and that is the fact that the only gate that you're allowed to put around a community in the United States is uh, housing prices. You gate purely by wealth means that you can't grow up around your kids, because by the time you're old enough that your kids are moving out of the house, you're going to be way wealthier than them, and they're not going to be able to afford to live in whatever neighborhood you're living in. And so uh, the 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 answer to that, I think, is to maximize the extent to which people are able to associate freely and able to gate their communities on the basis of more than just money, gate on the basis
Hmm.
of values. And so part of what I do with Exit is built around that. It's like, how do we, within the bounds of the law and within the bounds of like realism, create uh, the kind of neighborhoods that we want our kids to grow up in,
And what
and
are
that
some
our
of the uh, I'm sorry for interrupting, but what are some of the uh, issues with the law as it currently stands that sort of prevent this freedom of association? You said that pricing people out is basically the only thing you can do.
yeah.
Is that just
So
because if you try to create any other kind of association that's uh that's exclusive in any way, you'll immediately get sued for
yes, any
various
other
kinds
gate,
of civil rights violations? Like what is the
yeah, any other gate at scale is going to create a disparate impact situation.
hmm,
And if you're not familiar, disparate impact means that even if you're not like acting with racial or I think gender is one of them, even like family status and age to
hmm,
some extent. If you're not, if you are creating a bar to entry to your community that has a disparate impact, uh, that is illegal de facto. And
right.
so, you could, well, you can buy like a parcel and build a cul-de-sac with like 8 units and sell them to your friends. Like that's within the range of like it's too small for anybody to bother with. But if you are like building a master plan community and it's like the size of a village or the size of a small town, like that, uh you have to be like basically people are massively incentivized to sue you.
Hmm,
Massively incentivized. There's so much money in filing these types of complaints. And so, even if a person is not particularly ideological, if they're just sort of unscrupulous, uh, the 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 odds that they'll come after you on the basis of like, I belong to this protected category and you didn't let me in, um, is massive. It's the same thing with employment law. I mean, it's they've essentially created a situation where any large corporation is actually incentivized to like employ their own political officers to like watch over the dealings of the corporation and at every particular and be
hmm,
like, what's the craziest who's the craziest person, involved in this process, and what could they sue us over?
Right.
And so like their incentive is to be crazier than the craziest person. And that essentially creates these incentives where yeah, culture can't iterate because communities can't form, because you can't define what the community is, except in terms of, this community costs $850,000.
Yeah. So basically, you can't have, because of disparate impact, you cannot have freedom of association at scale. And
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and that's a tricky problem, because if you're trying to have an intentional community and it's wealth bound, then you're just pricing out any young people for the most part.
you're pricing out your own kids eventually.
Yeah. I know someone who lives in a small town in Michigan, and I've spent a lot of time there. And one of this one of my friends, they are the daughter of kind of like a local family that's kind of well known in that town. They've got a number of small businesses, and what's funny is that there's this whole road back back far back in the town, away from the downtown area,
Mhm.
where the mom and dad have a house. And then if you look a few blocks down, there's like the son's house and their daughter's house and their other
Right.
kids' house. And this family has just decided to keep buying plots of land around this road where they live on for their kids. And they have a
Yeah.
bunch of kids. Um, and the way they're able to do that, I mean, it helps that they're in a very small town, so the land is cheap. It's not very
Right.
expensive. Um, but part of the way that they did this was the parents made a deal with all of their kids. They said, "We will help you buy your first house, but it has to be near us. Like,
Yeah.
you can't move away," which might
Yeah.
seem like, a, a large constraint, but actually overall, I mean, all their kids have houses, right? Like, they're
Yeah.
not particularly wealthy, at least the kids aren't. And that's the deal that they agreed to. And they all have
And
property, they're all starting families.
and that's about as good as it gets.
Hmm.
And you can see the glaring problem with it, which is that like the patriarch, matriarch of that family has to be colossally wealthy, and B, they have to do it somewhere that is so undesirable and so far flung that like their kids will at minimum have to leave to find a mate, like who's or just sort of accept that they don't get to rise up to their parents' social status.
Hmm.
They can go marry a townie,
Yeah.
or they can go to university, and where get the whole suite of beliefs and everything else that comes with it, and go try to find somebody at that university who's a cultural fit, and bring them back to the compound. Which, do they even want to come back to the compound in middle of nowhere Kansas or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Like, you can see how the if you were to think of people as if they were an endangered species, it's like, this is how you're fucking with the mating pattern. This is how you are disrupting where they lay their eggs and where they, swim upstream to spawn. Like, you are fucking with it and it's breaking. And so like that's essentially my approach to it, is like, maybe we need to take the little uh, area of tigers in this part of the jungle and airlift them into this part of the jungle and get them, so there's not this like inbreeding problem. This is all real. Like, this is how like this tiger habitat issues, where they
Mm.
actually like, because they're being cut off from each other, they're becoming inbred and having all these diseases and problems. And so people really do, they pick them up in a helicopter and they drop them off, and hope they don't kill each other.
Yeah.
And so like that, like that's, I see it as essentially a conservation problem. It's just
Okay.
people.
So what kind of things is Exit Group working on, thinking about, with regard to sort of trying to clear a little bit of space to, make it affordable, make it attractive, make it reasonable to have families?
Yeah, so the biggest piece is entrepreneurship. Like that's it's not necessarily um it's the easiest thing for an individual to do to kind of make themselves more independent and break into a situation where they could potentially 2x, you know, the sort of average household income in the States. Like if you're not going to go into the professions, be a doctor, be a lawyer or whatever, like you probably need to start your own business. Like
Yeah.
as a standard wagey, the odds that you're going to be able to like climb the ladder fast enough to afford to do this in the right time is it's small. So entrepreneurship is a big piece of it. We also are trying to like get the guys together so that we can get our families connected in the local areas. Like we're trying to sort of throw up a flare and be like, you know, who around here cares about this? How can we get together? How can we get our kids together? Um, where's like the values alignment? And so we have meetups and and get the guys together talking about what they're building and trying to work on things together. And then yeah, in the long run, uh, I'm interested in disrupting or updating the country club model for guys who are more, you know, uh, like the sort of Zoomer millennial tech bro guy. He wants a lot of what the country club used to represent, but it kind of doesn't represent that anymore. And also, he like doesn't care about golf.
Hmm.
And so, you know, maybe instead of the cigar room, maybe it's a server farm and a CNC machine and a 3D printer and like sort of co-working space and hot and cold plunge and all, you know, all sort of amenities that would bring together smart, capable, uh, you know, getting things done guys and their families.
Hmm.
So that's one piece of it. And I basically I'm trying to figure out how do you solve this in a way that's like productizable so that it pays for itself and so that you can generate a proof of concept. Um, because otherwise, like everybody else's plan that I've seen
Hmm.
is like, okay, I've got this beautiful utopian vision, and I just need my billionaire benefactor to show up
Yeah.
so that, and it's, you know, for one thing, I think the mindset that waits around for the billionaire benefactor is not attractive to billionaire benefactors, in my experience.
Hmm.
Um, So it's like number one, we're not going to wait for that guy. And number two, if that guy should show up, I want to be like hard at work, you know, under construction. We're getting it done. We're seeing some results. We're making some money. It's happening. Do you want to be along for the ride? Um, so yeah, that's sort of and that does to some extent distort uh the order in which you would do it if you just had unlimited money. But I think it's an important step.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you think at risk of like stating the obvious, what are some of the things that you think are missing that, a group like that, if it were to reestablish itself for the younger generations, for millennial and Zoomer men, um, that they would be getting out of that because a common refrain is that like men's groups are basically de facto legal, um, and there's some truth to that. But also, it's hard to get these things going. It's hard to get people to do simple things like pay dues and show up to meetings and actually care about what's happening in them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of distractions, a lot of uh, ulterior obligations, especially if the members that you want to have are very high quality people. They're going to be busy. They're going to have stuff going on. They're going to have families of their own to take care of in a lot of cases. Um, so, but what are some of the benefits of selling something like this to these young guys or
One of
for
the
these young
hardest,
guys?
yeah, one of the hardest things about persuading a smart, competent woman to start a family with you is the fear that she is signing up to be like a domestic and that she's signing up to be isolated and like out of touch. And one of the things that I think a physical community can create is a situation in which my wife, your wife, you know, the guys can get their families together and the wives understand like, hey, we're part of something that's actually pretty freaking cool and transformative, and we're actually like doing something powerful and interesting with our lives. And it, you know, I am not a domestic servant. I am part of this. Like my wife uh will be, we've had occasions where like we'll be, you know, we'll have good friends in a particular area and she will be like making dinner or folding laundry, and the emotional valence of that experience when she's alone versus when she's with a friend, radically different. Radically different. Like there was this tweet going around, this was a while ago, but it was women like doing the, I think they were washing the clothes, but they were like doing it in this like, it was like European women from like the early 20th century in England, and they're or somewhere in Europe, and they're doing the laundry in this like rhythmic way, and they're singing a song,
Hmm.
and there were all these women who were like,
Oh yeah.
goals, like that's what I want, that's so cool. And it's like, it's the laundry, but when it's, you're part of a community and you're like doing something together, like that's and when it's regarded as like you're cool for doing this. And so like you want to create a situation where it's like not just the other wives, but like the people, like the community as a whole is like, you're cool for doing this. And like it's, it means something that you're doing. It basically just changing the valuation of that
Hmm.
work, because it's
Yeah.
massively important work and it goes way beyond chores.
Hmm.
And and so that's one thing. Another thing is the ways you sort of mentioned the difficulty of socializing. And part of that is because the way that women socialize is face to face. We're going to share feelings. We're going to like mind meld and like try to like empathize and connect emotionally. Guys socialize side to side. You know, you and I changing the oil. You and I building the fence.
Hmm.
Like that's almost every guy, like his best memory of like really connecting with other dudes is something like that. And so we, our sort of defining ethos of the whole group is like, we're going to create lots of situations where we can do that kind of thing. And thereby you find it's not just about like, oh, I found good friends. It's like I learned who actually like shows up on time and who actually like knows a lot about this or that topic, and like who actually would be useful as a co-founder, because like maybe I'm you know, really good on the technical side, but I'm not a people person. But this guy, man, he just got everybody organized and he figured it out, and that was really cool. So he's a guy that I need to work with.
Hmm.
Um, those kinds of like, you can't define that for everybody because their needs are so different. But producing an environment full of that kind of serendipity is what it's all about, in my opinion.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I gotta think about that. I think you're right, basically, that the especially the revaluation of the roles of motherhood and domestic caretaking is a big part of it, because so many women both fear that, but also even once they get into that, uh, there's so much messaging in our society that it's a negative thing, that you're being, subservient, that you're underappreciated, that you're, a domestic slave, something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's not just the messaging,
mhm.
it's the reality. Like women will go like, you know, I have all kinds of stories of like the tech bro living in the Bay, his wife stays home and she takes their kids to the park to go make friends and play. and the kids make friends and play, but she's surrounded by everybody else's nannies.
Mm.
And she's like, shit, I'm a nanny. That's my role in this society.
Yeah. I'm a
And
glorified
she's not,
nanny.
yeah, and she's like, she's not in terms of the social perception, she's not wrong. Like she's around women who really will like shit on her for doing what she's doing. And that like maybe it's the case that guys can sort of act against social opprobrium, uh, but they're not really being asked to in that way. And it's a tall order. And so in respecting that difficulty, it's like we have to create a situation where she's actually going to meet some ladies who are like as smart as she is
Mhm.
and as interesting as she is and doing the kinds of cool stuff that she's doing. And because then like I just don't believe that anybody really, men or women, is like so freaking fulfilled by being like an Amazon project manager. Like everybody's doing that to get paid. But to the extent that they value that opportunity in contrast to raising a family, I suspect a lot of that is like, nah, but I get to be around interesting people and I get to have cool experiences that I couldn't have if I was stuck at home,
Yeah.
which is how they always frame it, stuck at home.
Yeah.
And so like you got to break that out.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to offer them something that's not going to remove that from their life. And yeah, I think this isolation component is a big part of it, right?
Huge,
Um,
huge.
um, so I know that the Natal Conference is planning to continue on into the future. And there's one that we're in the midst of getting together. By we, I mean you and the others, not me personally. Are in the midst of getting together for this year. So can you drop us a little bit of a teaser about what can we expect for the coming year? Natal Conference 2, it sounds like it's going to happen. It sounds like there's
Yeah.
some more interest than there was in the previous year. It's going to be sort of bigger, better. There's going to be more um, uh, features for the attendees and probably some more interesting speakers. So tell us a little bit about what's in the works for that.
Yeah. So I want to be careful about it because a lot of things are in flux right now.
Mhm.
But what we're essentially looking at is, so first of all, the unconference was a big hit. We found that a lot of people really got a lot out of being able to kind of jump from room to room, hear from each other. Because like, we brought together impressive speakers, but the crowd itself was, I mean, a lot of those people were like just as interesting, had just as much cool stuff going on, and we needed to hear from a lot of those people. So I'm glad we did that. We're going to expand that. We're probably going to have fewer like sit and listen talks. We're going to try to find a couple like higher profile people to give a handful of keynote type addresses,
Mhm.
but a lot of it's going to be sort of user provided, and we're probably going to do it in a more intimate setting, um, so that and maybe a little bit more of an attractive setting. Which I thought the line was great. Food was good. It was an attractive venue, but I think we can actually do better this year, and I'm excited to see what that looks like. Also, one of the biggest items of feedback, which was obvious in hindsight, was if the goal is to gather people who want to start families, then a prohibitive ticket price, for people in their 20s that's tough. So we're going to have some side events in addition that are going to be cheaper free. That I mean, gated enough that and Austin's a little bit of a blue city. We want to kind of vet a little bit,
Mhm.
but just for security reasons.
Yeah.
But we're going to create a situation where some younger people can afford to be there, and it's a little bit more of a social, uh, less conference like, and more social. And so those are going to be the big sort of adjustments from last year. I felt like there was a lot of good sort of juice from the last one. We're not going to change too much, but yeah, the unconference, change of venue, um, some. There were several people who reached out to me who were like, "Okay, now that I've seen that you can do it, I'll participate more. I'll be more involved with this next one."
Hmm.
So, and that's investors. That's a couple public figures who were a little gun shy about the first round. Um, and then yeah, the social kind of side events. Those are going to be the big changes.
Well, that's very exciting. I'm really happy that this is a success and that you're going to go forward and you're getting more commitment and more investment and interest after sort of a kind of proof of concept because there's tremendous amount of cultural interest in this and it's by and large completely disregarded as even a valid topic by pretty much every other institution in our society. So I think what you're doing is very important, and I just want to applaud you for putting in the work to make this happen.
No, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. I have great partners. David Moore and Drew Gorham helped me put it together, and absolutely couldn't have done it without them. And we had a great uh, assistant, Barbara Williams, who put a ton of it together. It's definitely not a one man show.
Hmm.
So a lot of and frankly, tons of volunteers and tons of people who were willing to kind of pay their own way to get out there and help us make it good. So like, yeah, it was huge. There's a lot of juice behind this movement. I think you can call it a movement. A lot of people who are trying to push the ball forward. So it's an exciting time, and I'm excited to do it again.
Yeah, well, we're trying to get people to have more babies. So,
Yes, indeed.
all right, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.